So I'm going to talk a bit about Heathrow and the issues with its claims to be climate friendly. And then I'm going to cover some of the wide spectrum of false solutions that the aviation industry is pushing as a way to keep on flying. And most of these solutions either don't work or don't exist. And finally, I'm going to talk briefly about demand reduction, which is a solution that would actually work. So this is Heathrow's breakdown of its carbon emissions. As you can see, Heathrow is an airport. Its main business is getting planes into the air. So they've been very loud about their efforts to cut emissions from Heathrow's ground-based operations. But as you can see, that makes up just 5% of emissions from the airport. 95% of their emissions come, as you would expect, from airplanes, which are spewing out carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. And Heathrow likes to talk about becoming a zero carbon airport with measures like improving its energy efficiency, using renewable energy. But this narrative from the airport really is at best misleading. It gives consumers a completely inaccurate impression about the environmental harm that's caused by flying. They're very loud about their efforts to cut the 5% of their emissions that comes from their ground operations, but at the same time, they are actively pursuing policies which would make the 95% of their emissions from flying even bigger. And let's not forget that at the moment, while Heathrow is speaking at the Net Zero Festival and they're trying to position themselves as a company that's really engaged on climate change, they are also taking legal action to challenge the Court of Appeal judgment that the third runway was unlawful on the grounds of its climate impacts. So that's very clearly not the action of a company which is willing to put the planet above its profits. Heathrow is already the UK's largest single source of emissions. Their plans for the third runway would add around another 9 million tonnes of carbon dioxide emissions per year. And that in itself would take up around 1/10 of our carbon budget in 2050. So the narrative that Heathrow is pushing also contributes to the wider problem of greenwashing around aviation emissions. So this shows the Committee on Climate Change, which is the UK's official advisors on climate. This is their projections about what the UK is going to be emitting in 2050. And as you can see, flying, which is the purple box on the left-hand side, is going to take up about 1/3 of the UK's carbon emissions by then. But even that relies on a huge chunk. So to balance it out and get to net zero, that relies on a huge chunk of carbon dioxide removals. So allowing aviation to continue only works if we can remove millions of tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere each year. Right now we can't, nobody's ever done this. There's huge issues with any of the technologies which are proposed as a way to do this. The aviation industry likes to throw around the figure that it only produces 2% of the world's carbon dioxide emissions. But in the UK, because people here fly a lot, it's more like 10%. And there's also the issue that as well as carbon dioxide, planes also produce other greenhouse gases. And that means that their total warming impact on the climate is about twice the size, at least, of their emissions from carbon dioxide alone. So emissions from flying are really not an insignificant problem. There's also the issue that aviation is a luxury product. About 9 in 10 flights from the UK are for leisure travel. These aren't survival emissions. It's something which is incredibly unequally distributed, both within the UK and globally, in terms of who gets the benefit from the flight and who is already suffering from the impacts of the climate crisis. In the UK, as you can see from this graphic, around 70% of flights are taken up by just 15% of the population. And around half of people don't fly at all in any given year. So there's huge issues around equality. So aviation is difficult to decarbonise. In other areas, alternatives to using fossil fuels are ready to go, and they're often actually cheaper, like using renewable energy. there isn't an alternative to fossil fuel powered planes available, particularly for long haul flights, which need to carry a lot of people. But what we do have is some incredibly optimistic projections by the aviation industry about how these technologies could develop in the future. And that comes along with a reliance on false solutions, which could cause as much climate harms as the solution that they're trying to fix, such as offsetting. And the industry attempts to use the prospect of technologies which don't exist yet, like electric planes, to avoid implementing the only solution which would work for tackling aviation emissions now, which is demand reduction. And this is something which Heathrow does to try to justify its expansion. So this shows Heathrow's projections for how it plans to tackle its emissions. And huge chunks of this are things like future aircraft. Well, that basically means imaginary aircraft. They've drawn a picture of it and it looks very nice, but it's not something they can actually roll out onto the runway and use as a form of low carbon transport. And there's also a chunk called MBMs, and what that stands for is market-based emissions. And what that means is that they're going to pay somebody else to cut their emissions instead. So this comes back to what David was saying. It's the idea that certain people who are wealthy enough can continue burning fossil fuels, and they'll pay other people, usually poorer people in the global south, to cut their emissions instead. That's clearly not a just or effective approach to tackling climate change. So I'm going to quickly whiz through some of the proposed solutions which aren't going to cut it. So offsetting, the main issue is that planting trees is just not equivalent to leaving fossil fuels in the ground. Trees take decades, if not centuries, to grow. And during that time, the emissions from flying are still in the atmosphere. They're contributing to warming, and they're contributing to effects of that warming which are not reversible, even if the trees suck up the carbon as planned, like melting ice caps. There's also the issue that forests can be burned down or cut down, especially in a warmer world. Biofuels, there's a limited supply of agricultural land, and if you want to use huge amounts of plants to create jet fuel, then that's going to bring serious risks of pushing up food prices, increasing hunger, and it's also very likely to increase deforestation, which would itself have huge climate impact. So synthetic fuels, it's technically possible to create jet fuel from carbon dioxide captured from the air. No one's ever done it as more than a tiny, tiny prototype, and the energy required to do this is enormous. If the current demand for flying was to be powered by synthetic fuels, we would need more electricity than the world's current renewables capacity in order to supply this. I mean, clearly not realistic. Negative emissions, that's kind of a similar concept in which planes would keep on flying, but the carbon they emit would be captured from the air and stored. Again, technically possible, huge demand for electricity, never been generated at scale, raises a lot of issues around permanency of the storage, and also fails to do anything about the warming from the other greenhouse gases emitted by planes, not just the carbon dioxide. Small electric planes are in development, but there are serious issues around battery weight, which is going to make long haul flights very difficult. And there's also the time it would take to develop them and safety test them and roll them out, which would be decades. There just isn't time to wait 30 or 40 or 50 years before tackling aviation emissions.
That's 2 minutes, Ali.
2 minutes, okay. Hydrogen planes have some similar problems in terms of the technology just not being developed and having some issues around the volume that it takes to store hydrogen. So the framing of net zero is part of the problem with these false solutions. It makes it seem okay to keep burning fossil fuels because there will be a way to remove the emissions. But this concept is being used today by fossil fuel companies to justify keeping on burning fossil fuels. So if the technical solutions don't work, where do we go? flying less works to reduce emissions. A progressive tax on flying, such as a frequent flyer levy or a tax on air miles, this would help to reduce the frequent flying, which makes up the majority of flights. So this kind of tax would go up per flight that someone takes in a given time period, or per the distance that they fly. And so it would progressively penalise those who are flying the most. And this is necessary in order to ensure that emissions are cut in a way that's fair to everyone. And this is something that has to be applied across policies to tackle climate change. It needs to be fair. The people who are polluting the most need to make the biggest cuts. So finally, why now? At the moment, aviation is going through an unprecedented crisis due to COVID. Why is now the time to bring in a tax on frequent flying? Well, this moment is potentially an opportunity to think about what a transport system that works for people and the planet would look like, rather than just going back to business as usual and dangerous levels of pollution. We need measures put in place now to limit flying. And in order to do that, we need to challenge the greenwashing narrative which the aviation industry is pushing out, which relies on solutions which don't work or don't exist.